Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins to feed, so like I do sometimes, I've put together a little list, a little to-do list for myself of what I want to tackle today. And yesterday I was down here feeding what I refer to as being my three youngest worm bins. And today I'm down here to feed not even three oldest, but rather two. So let's see if we can fix that. I'm down here to feed my two oldest worm bins, red wiggler worm bins, that is, to be more specific. There are three that I consider as the oldest. So the two that you see listed here, the 125-day-old bin, is the one that's up in the upper right-hand corner of the shelf. And the one that comes on the list right after that, the 82-day-old bin, is the one that's right down here to the left on the lower shelf. But the oldest bin is actually up here. The oldest red wiggler bin is now migrating, so that bin's not being fed anymore. That bin is actually in the process of being depopulated, with the worms being worked out of the finished compost. And that leaves me with these two bins here that I want to feed today. There isn't a great deal of distinction between these two, but the one oddity is that the younger of the two, the 82-day-old bin, I don't know if it's because maybe it's got a greater number of worms in it or what, but for whatever reason, it does seem like it's possibly making even better progress than the older bin is. Because if you look at the material in there, it's really fine. It looks like it could possibly be ready for harvest even sooner than the bin that's older than it. So I'm going to get these two bins up onto the bench today, give them some food, and hopefully everything's working well. So let's get to work. So the older of the bins, the 125-day-old bin, is what we have here in front of us. We'll begin by feeding this one. It's set up much the same as most of my bins. It's got a covering to keep the light out, because right beneath it there's a sort of translucent, almost transparent piece of plastic that would let all the light in. But I want it to remain nice and dark there, because right underneath the plastic I like the idea of worms coming up to bask in the moisture that collects because of the plastic. And when there's no worms coming up to take advantage of the moisture, you see puddles and moisture everywhere. But it seems like when the worms are coming up on a regular basis to take advantage of the moisture, the paper doesn't seem quite as damp. And I assume it's because they're coming by and they're sipping it all up. So there was only a couple of worms hanging out on top. I figured I would just get them off before we remove the paper. This piece of paper, this coffee filter, that was resting over here in the corner, this is just indicating to us where we had last fed, which was in this corner. Something I've been doing in all of my red wiggler bins lately, as of a couple weeks ago, I started a pocket feeding regimen, and I started in this corner here, feeding here. Last week I fed here. So this week we're going to be shifting to this next corner, working our way around clockwise and feeding the bin down in here. The material looks really nice. Everything's got this really nice dark color to it. It's nice and damp. And you know, even though that this bin is a little bit older than the next one that we're going to feed, in that other bin, it seems like there's no scraps of paper like this, or maybe there are, but I just don't see them as much, or whatever the case may be. But I've often commented how I believe that the progress of this bin is a little bit hampered by something, I don't know what. Or maybe that's not even the case. Maybe it's just that the progress in that other bin is somehow accelerating, or more productive than this bin here. So I've occasionally even thought to myself and mentioned as well that it is possible that even though this bin is older, it might take more time for it to, you know, gradually break down all of these little leaf stems and sticks and other larger uncomposted bits of bedding, like these pieces of paper, because that other bin just seems like it might be ready for harvest sooner. So you'll see when we get into that bin. unless I was imagining, but that's the way I remember it. I'm pretty sure that that was the case, that for whatever reason, maybe this is a larger population in that other bin. It's been really just zooming along and doing so well. So what I'm doing here while I'm chatting is I thought to myself how I might be able to help things along, to help the bin get to the finish line more rapidly. And there's not much I could do when it comes to these sticks and stems, I believe. You know, the worms are just going to have to work that stuff down on their own. I can't go picking that stuff all up, but I thought that if I could, maybe I would kind of sift through and try to find bits and pieces of paper and bedding which was not yet broken down, so we could kind of pile it up and use it as the foundation for this next feeding. I don't know what it is about this this paper here. Maybe it was just added very recently or something, but there's like no signs of any consumption, and it makes me wonder if it's something wrong with that paper. You know, usually you see newspaper, for example, you'll see the very edges of it getting nibbled at, maybe because that's the easiest place for the worms to take a bite. But when you look at some of this paper, it seems like it's just not getting broken down. I don't know why. Maybe it's got some sort of a treatment or something that's preventing it from getting broken down. I don't know. My idea here was to possibly collect up some of this stuff, you know, random scraps of paper from throughout the bin, without going crazy doing like a huge search party. But still, trying to collect up as much of this stuff as I could in the matter of just a couple minutes, at least enough to lay down a foundation for the feeding. So we're going to be feeding down here in this corner. So we've already, in a way, started excavating there. And I think we'll have to come back and excavate again, because I'm going to keep rummaging around here really quickly to see if I can round up a little pile of bedding type scraps, paper bits. And we're going to use that as the foundation for today's feeding. Seems like if we can sort of isolate that stuff together with the food that they're getting, then it might get a little bit more attention and maybe increase the chances of that stuff getting broken down a little bit more rapidly. Here's a couple more bits of that shredded paper. And for some reason, it just seems like the clean cut edges, the way it was shredded, the way it came out of the shredder, just seems like there's no nibbling, no deterioration on the edges. They just have these really crisp cut edges with virtually no signs of breakdown. So, I don't know, hopefully I didn't end up using some sort of material that's not going to break down in my bins. But you could see that we're accumulating a pretty good little pile of paper here. All stuff that I think would benefit from being positioned right near the next feeding that we're going to give them. Hopefully giving this stuff a greater chance at being broken down. If the stuff is just scattered throughout the bin, you know, all over the place, it doesn't seem like it would have any reason to see any sort of increase in worm traffic. But if we could position it right where the feeding is going to be placed, that might actually give it a little bit of a benefit. So that was my thinking, mainly because this is a 125-day-old bin, and, you know, as much as I would like to see stuff like these little sticks all break down, and they will in time, there's not much I could do about it, but I figured as far as the paper's concerned, maybe I can do something about, you know, speeding along the process to help it all break down too. So I guess this is affording us a little quick glimpse into how the previous feeding zones are looking. Prior to me starting the pocket feeding approach, before I started feeding in that corner and then this corner, I was always feeding down the middle, and that would only be maybe 3 weeks ago at this point. Feeding here was a week ago, here was 2 weeks ago. So the food that was placed down the middle was put there 3 weeks ago or thereabouts. And it's not surprising that we're seeing a good number of worms hanging out in there. I mean, we might even bump into a piece of food scrap down in here that the worms are still working on. Like, I believe this might even be a piece of banana peel. Huh. I don't know. Doesn't matter. I had originally thought to myself, hey, if I can keep all of the older food scraps right where they were when I put them into the bin, then we could check in on those food scraps from time to time to get a little bit of a look at how they're progressing. It's like, here's a banana stem, and it looks pretty whole, but I can tell from touching it, it feels like the middle of it has been pretty much burrowed out. So maybe that's one of the sort of things we can just keep it right there in the middle so that we can continue checking in occasionally, and if we rummage around down in there a week from now, we'll know that it was 4 weeks ago that this was placed in here. Although it's not really an accurate measure. First of all, I don't necessarily feed exactly every week. And another thing I do sometimes is I do round up food chunks and position them in the feeding zone. So this could be going back even further. Here I am, letting myself get distracted. I just can't seem to resist poking around my worm bins. So we've agitated the material over here. We've managed to salvage some pieces of paper. I'm going to go ahead and reposition that, at least that banana stem, back down where I believe it came from. It's hard to say how long it's been there at this point because, you know, the stuff that was placed down the middle goes back many, many feedings at this point. But if we were to inspect these other two corners, we can say for certain how long it's been since those pockets were fed. And then we can get a much better gauge on how those bits and pieces of leftovers in those areas, if there are any leftovers, are progressing relative to the amount of time that has passed. So before we get to applying today's feeding, why don't we take a quick peek to see how things are progressing. If I can minimize the disruption so that we can, you know, have this to check in on again in future feedings, then that would probably be the ideal scenario. More leaf stems, some sort of a stick. I don't know what it is, maybe a tomato stem or something. I don't see much of anything else. Maybe some bedding scraps, which I don't mind salvaging and pulling out. But if we find any other food scraps, we'll make sure we leave them in there so that we can get a sense of how long it's taking to break down. Because, you know, after a couple weeks, it's not surprising that the stem of something, whatever this might have been, is still breaking down. It'll take time. It's more or less wood. Maybe not that hard, but still it's tougher than just the leafy portion of something. Here's something a little bit larger, whatever this may be. I don't know offhand what it is. Who knows? Piece of, I don't know, sweet potato maybe or something. So I'm going to go ahead and place that back in here because I'm going to assume that that's where that came from. And if there's anything else in this pocket, maybe it's in this pile of material here. No, I don't think I'm seeing anything else. But things are working their way down pretty nicely in that corner after only 2 weeks. And there again, I may have placed materials in there that are just quick to decompose. Maybe there were small chopped items. Maybe there were a lot of really soft items. So it's never really a very good gauge because I don't really keep track of what it was that I had placed into each feeding zone each time. But now going back one feeding, this is where we would find the most recent feeding from just a week ago. And I could smell some of the food bits, and a lot of it is still pretty whole. You could see good sized chunks of stuff in here still, but a whole bunch of worms working at it, that's for sure too. I could smell the Brussels sprouts. I believe there were Brussels sprouts added, and I think I could smell them because, you know, Brussels sprouts are in that same family as cabbage and stuff like that. A little bit stinky. as it's breaking down. And after only a week's time with such a generous portion placed in here, it's not that surprising that there's still some leftovers. So that was interesting to see, but I'm not going to keep picking around through it. We'll cover it back up, let them continue. And, you know, we'll put the fresh food in here, even though there's a good amount of leftovers remaining. Because the fresh food will take time to break down. So as the worms continue to gobble up the feeding from a week ago, the bacteria and the fungus and the microbes in the bin will get a head start on the food that I'm putting in now, and set the stage for the worms to be able to eventually access that stuff as nourishment too. Alright, I don't know why I just get so sidetracked I can't seem to resist picking around and exploring within my bins, but I think it's time to feed. We've managed to collect a pretty good amount of recycled bedding materials, paper scraps, shredded paper bits that we're going to place in underneath the feeding. And like I said earlier, my only hope with that is that it'll help this stuff break down a little bit more rapidly than if it was just left scattered throughout the bin. So I'm placing it in here right underneath the food. And I guess the other reason for this is that I didn't really come down here with much bedding. I mean, I did pull a couple of these older coffee filters off the shelf, thinking that I might actually wrap the food within these. So I think I will actually drop the food within one of these in each case, just like we did last time. Pretty sure that's what we did last time. That's what I saw evidence of when we just poked around the previous feeding zone. Kind of giving the food a little bit of a wrap. And you know what, I'll save this nice fresh one to indicate where we last fed. What I'll do is I'll just grab this one that was serving the purpose of feeding zone indicator till now, and we'll use this one to bundle up the second handful of food. I'm going with really generous handfuls, and oops, what's this? That's something we don't want to put in the bin, right? Plastic would not ever compost down in a worm bin, so we don't include that in our feedings. But this is definitely a generous feeding. I tried to go really big on each handful. I've been using kind of the 2-handful portioning approach lately, for no other reason than just to have some degree of consistency so I can reflect on what I've done in the past and, who knows, use it as a standard, so to speak. But in this case, I do feel like I've exceeded that amount a little bit by using extremely loaded handfuls. And I think the main reason is that when I reached my hand into this bag, I felt like I did bring a good amount of material down here to feed with today. So my whole idea behind doing it that way was to maybe get rid of it all so I don't have to take it back up into the freezer. Okay, so we've more or less turned this bin upside down. We've looked in every corner and looked at how things are progressing in every area of the bin, and things look really nice. So I'm going to get things covered up again here. We'll put this fresh coffee filter down to indicate where we last fed, and put back our little piece of paper, almost like a drop cloth, where the moisture that collects on the plastic above it can drop onto. Create a little bit of a moisture haven for the worms. And it always gets nice and soaked with moisture too, as a result of being right there too. And in time the worms will start chewing away at that newspaper as well. But what I'd really like to see is, I'd like to see them start chewing away on the paper that's been placed under the feeding as bedding for them. Alright, things are looking pretty good here in my 125-day-old red wiggler bin. Let's go get the other one. Alright, so now this is younger and it's younger by, I don't even know, more than a month. It's an 82-day-old bin versus a 125-day-old bin. But I've oftentimes felt like the material in this bin might actually be further along and more mature looking than the bin that we just fed. So I've commented occasionally that this bin might actually be ready for harvest sooner. But I've never really looked at it that closely to really see if those observations were true, or was it just a gut feeling I was getting. Maybe we could do a little bit of a deeper dive on that topic today and look at things a little bit more closely to see if that's really even a possibility. So like you saw earlier on my notes, this bin has received 17 feedings, and the first of those would actually be the food that was placed into the bin when the bin was originally built. So after the bin was built and the worms were added to it, it received 16 feedings since then. I just always consider the food that was placed in the bin when it was built as one of the feedings too. So this is its 18th feeding, and it's getting pretty full. It's got some nice weight to it. Maybe not full, you know, it's a pretty good sized bin. And I would say it's about halfway full, but as you saw, sometimes I like to till things up and air things out and pile stuff up. And for that reason, it's nice to have a little bit extra space within the bin to be able to do that. If you're right at the limit of your capacity, then, you know, you just don't have room to be able to rummage around and explore and do things. So I like to leave a little bit of room in my bins to make working on the bin a little bit easier. Now, the feeding area was marked over here, and I can even see a little bit of a depression. It's always kind of clear to see where the most recent feeding had occurred, because there always seems to be kind of a void left behind due to the depletion of the food that had been in there. I don't know if I really want to go picking around, although I had liked that idea of sort of salvaging as much of the paper I could find from within the bin to use that as the foundation for the feeding, to get the paper bits and the leftover scraps of bedding into a location where it has a greater chance of getting the attention it needs to get broken down. So maybe we could do sort of an abbreviated version of that in here too. Kind of collecting up some scraps of paper and bedding materials and plopping it down into the feeding zone before we add today's feeding. So let's see, we're going to be feeding in here. We're going to be digging around in here anyway. So let's see what we can see over here. The material doesn't seem quite as damp in here as it did in the other bin. It seems a lot more crumbly, a lot more loose. I'm finding little sticks and stems and stuff like that down in here. Almost sticks for sure, you know. I mean, what's gonna become of a little stick like this? It's never gonna break down, so I don't know. I broke it into little chunks, maybe that'll help. But let's see what we can locate as far as recyclable paper bits. I am finding food chunks, and I find myself piling them onto the collection. Here too, the material seems a lot more flaky and dry than it did in the other bin. And I don't mind that. As the bin starts to get a little bit older, I know that I'm getting closer to the point where I'm going to want to harvest it. Here's another fairly good sized stick. I'm starting to wonder if it might be a good idea to be picking that stuff out. It's never going to get broken down. And my method of separating worms from castings, usually, most lately, doesn't always rely on a sifting of the materials. It just assumes that the materials are all more or less broken down. So I don't know if I'll really have opportunities to pull out large chunks of stuff like that. Good number of sticks and stems in here too. So maybe I'm not really quite as close to harvest on these bins as I had thought. Here's a little plum pit. All right, why don't we do this? I'm going to move our salvaged material pile over here, which is really kind of turning into a collection of salvaged food items, not just bedding materials. I want to use this as a chance to poke around over here too a bit before we move inboard. We can check the middle of the bin, which takes us back a few weeks since it's been last fed. See how things are progressing down in there. Then we can make our way over to the two corners that were fed most recently, last week and the week before. Very nice material. Although I am always bumping into stuff which feels to me like maybe the outer husk of a mango seed. I just collected 2 pieces of it right over here. Oh, and here's like a peach pit. Another fairly large item. So whatever, I guess whatever food bits we managed to collect here, some sort of a stem, we'll just go ahead and place them down into this feeding area with today's feeding, and then we'll just leave them be. Let them stay there, and we'll check in on those bits at another time in the future. It'll just become a little more difficult to distinguish, you know, say these 2 stems from stuff that was actually placed in here today, because these stems must go back a month at this point, if not longer. So it'll kind of skew our observations of this corner here, because it won't just be food that we added fresh today. It'll be sort of a mix, but that's fine. We're not doing anything scientific here. So yeah, like I said, this is going back 1 week, 2 weeks. So this is the center area where we haven't fed now for about 3 weeks. So any scraps we find should be tougher materials, like these banana stems. This one almost being gone at this point. More mango husk that I just located. So I'm just curious to see how things look down in here, but at the same time, not only satisfying my curiosity, but also just aerating the material a little bit. Make sure it's all nice and loose and easy for the worms to pass through. And at the same time, I'm also, you know, scoping out how some of the different scraps of food are progressing. The one thing you might notice, though, is I'm not finding a lot of scrap bedding. Here's a piece of cardboard. But somehow the worms seem to be making their way through that a lot more quickly in this bin. Because I'm not finding all kinds of leftovers like I did in the other bin. I don't know. I'm not sure what I can chalk that up to. Greater population, who knows what. Whatever the reason is, it's a good sign. I like to see it. So let's move on. Let's take a peek at how things look here for the feeding that was applied 2 weeks ago. There's like a little stem of something here. A little bit more damp, but not too much. Here's another stem of something. Looks like part of a carrot, not carrot, a radish. Looks like part of a radish has that distinct pink reddish color. Reddish, radish. So maybe these radish bits are going to take a little while. I think the radish bits were placed in here along with a whole bunch of radish leaves. And there's no sign of the leaves. Those leaves all got gobbled up, 1, 2, 3. So it's possible that just those little bits of radish are all that remain in this feeding from 2 weeks ago. So let's put those right back down where we found them. Let them continue. Then we can get another glimpse at them at some point in the future again, maybe. Unless, of course, the worms manage to do away with it next time we go looking for that stuff. Now, the feeding from a week ago, I don't recall what it consisted of, but it was probably very similar to what we saw in the previous bin that we just checked in on. This is a half of an avocado pit. Sometimes I try to see if I could break them, because avocado pits are super tough. But over time they become soft and malleable, and you could just crack one in half in your hand if you wanted to, after it's been in the worm bin for a while. So now let's see, what can we do to just take a quick glimpse at how things are progressing in here. There's a good number of worms. And I could feel it. It's just, wow. You could see some of the bedding and paper that was in here with the food, but it's drawing a huge crowd. Very nice. So I'm not going to pick through this too much, but I could still see little chunks of remaining food, little scraps of leftovers that they've not yet polished off. But when I run my fingers through here, I think what I feel primarily is worms. You can feel chunks of stuff in here, little chunks of food here and there. I believe whatever was here in my hand is the largest chunk I could feel. And I believe because it's just wrapped somehow within paper. Yep, it's a banana peel. Banana peel is a pretty good sized chunk of food that's going to take a little bit of time to break down. So we'll definitely leave that down in the feeding area. And let's just try to return everything back down to where it was. These worms can stay out here, but all these food chunks, the banana peel, and not much of anything else distinguishable is getting put right back down in there. Okay, I like the way things look in here, that's for sure. This is a fun bin to check in on because it is very busy. Here's that avocado seed. We'll put that right back where we found it. And get today's feeding applied. I don't know, this must be therapeutic or something, because otherwise why would somebody spend so much time doing this? I can't explain it. I just find myself semi-fascinated by coming down here to feed the worms. It's just so interesting to see what they're doing, see what kind of progress they're making. So I just found these little pits again, trying to keep it all together so that we can sink it all down into the feeding area. Give this stuff a chance at being broken down. Yeah, you can see as I start to pile stuff up here, I'm already at the upper rim of this container, so it doesn't take much. I mean, I guess the first thing was that I fluffed everything in the bin up, so I'm sure all in all we've probably increased the space requirements of all the material by a good 15-20% just by fluffing it all up. And then on top of that, now I'm digging a fresh hole down here to place the food into today. I think what I'm going to do though is I'm going to take that old stuff that we found and I'm going to plop that on top instead of placing it down below. So let's see what we could do in terms of using up as much of this feeding as possible. I'm going to see what I could do about maybe overstuffing this portion for them a bit, because this is a very busy bin and seems to do a really good job breaking down all the food it gets. So I'm not going to worry so much about maybe placing a little bit more in here than I did into the other bin. So let's do the same thing as we did before. We're going to reuse the old feeding zone indicator, and then I'll just replace it with a fresh one after we've fed. And at this point, I'm going to do my best to enclose it in this piece of paper, but I'm just pouring at this point whatever remains. Clearly there's not a huge amount of importance in keeping it nested within the paper, but it does seem like as it all melts and gets gooey, and I don't know if melt is the right word, but as it all starts to decompose and break down and get gooey and the worms start working it all down, the paper will all soak up all the juices and flavors and everything else, making it into a really nice spot for the worms to be. All right, let's make sure we put everything else that we found down in there too. So this is now pocket feeding number 3. We've now gone from corner number 1 to corner number 2 and corner number 3 down here. So when we get back into feeding here next time, which I don't know when that'll be, probably don't have to wait a week this time. We could probably wait a little bit longer because both bins were fed quite generously. But whenever that might be, it'll be this last corner when we come back in here to feed. And at that point, we will have made our way all the way around the bin, giving each corner an opportunity at being fed. So let's mark where we fed. Let's put that coffee filter right there to indicate to us where to find the feeding next time we come in here if we go looking for it. And I don't know, that might actually be, who knows, 8 days, 10 days from now. 8 days is not much different from a week, so it does seem like waiting maybe 10 or 12 days between now and the next feeding of this bin would make pretty good sense. Because I don't think they're going to do away with all that food so quickly, especially since we found leftovers from the previous feeding down in there as well. It does seem like waiting at least 10 days, 8 or 10 days between now and the next feeding is a good idea. So I've got a little bit of cleanup to do, but not much. Well, we did manage to deplete all of the food, which is a good thing. So I'll take care of cleaning everything up around here and putting things away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. But before I go, let me really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.